So in this lesson, we're going to be talking about blood vessels. And so this is the next section in our discussion around the human circulatory system. So blood vessels, let's talk about just generally speaking, very simplistic terms. We know that in the human body, we see a closed circulatory system. And so you can sort of think of it as a closed loop. So if we think about blood flow beginning in the heart, so imagine deoxygenated blood in the heart. Where is it going next? Well, I'm hoping you thought about it going to the lungs. Why does it need to go to the lungs? Because it needs to get reoxygenated. So blood going from the heart to the lungs. Where's the next step in its journey? Most people think it's body. However, it's the heart. So blood goes from the heart to the lungs to get oxygen, returns back to the heart. Why does it need to return back to the heart, you might be thinking? Well, the blood needs a way to actively get pumped out to the body, and the way that it does that is by returning to the heart, which is this thick muscular organ. So then once that heart pumps our blood out to our body then uses the oxygen that is being carried in the blood along with some other material. It grabs onto some CO2 that our cells don't need anymore and is a waste product, and recycles it back to the heart and then eventually the lungs, and on and on and on as the circuit goes. So here is just a different, very simplistic look at the human circulatory system. Now, there are a lot of labels here, and try as I might, I couldn't find a nice, simpler version of this without labels. But it does it does allow me to have a conversation about blood vessels in the human body. Um, so typically when we talk about the human circulatory system, we talk about where the blood is flowing in three different distinct ways. We talk about, first of all, blood that flows from the heart to the lungs where it's grabbing oxygen. And that we call the pulmonary system. So our pulmonary circulatory system is that part of the circulatory system where blood is flowing between the heart and the lungs. And if you know any French, you'll know that the French word for lungs is poumon. And so that may help you remember pulmonary. So pulmonary is an adjective that refers to anything related to the lungs. Next, we can just simply talk about the blood that's flowing through the heart itself, right? Just through the heart itself. And so we call that the coronary. And so not just blood flowing through the heart, but also we have a coronary artery that provides blood supply to the heart itself. And we're going to explore that a little bit later. And so lastly, we can talk about the blood that is traveling from the heart and going out to the rest of the body. And a couple of things before I get into that, you'll notice that the blood vessels around the heart are quite large. We have the superior and inferior vena cava, we have the aorta. Those are very large blood vessels, but as blood moves from the heart to other parts of the body, the blood vessels become increasingly smaller, and that just creates a really large surface area for diffusion to occur across membranes. So here we're representing this as a capillary network, and that's just indicating the high surface area where the blood is actually going and trying to diffuse materials from the bloodstream into the body. And so that we call that systemic blood flow. And that's just blood flow between the body and the heart. So there we have three circulatory systems in mammals. Again, pulmonary, coronary, and systemic. Okay, so here is I liked this diagram in your textbook because it doesn't go into too much detail, but it also kind of reinforces what I was talking about. The heart is a large muscular organ, and its job is to pump blood from itself to the rest of the body, and sometimes against gravity. So there's a lot of power there. And so you'll notice that the blood vessels coming from the heart or going towards the heart tend to be larger. Just a quick reminder, arteries in general well, not in general, but they move blood away from the heart, whereas veins bring blood back to the heart. So artery away, veins towards. I think of the French word vient, which means come, so coming towards the heart. Now, as again, then the heart, again, highly muscular, lots of pressure there. If we had smaller vessels, then they might burst under that high degree of pressure. So as the blood's moving through, it's going through smaller and smaller vessels, right? So a small artery we call an arteriole. Okay, capillaries are sort of not distinctive because they're sort of in between where oxygen is getting diffused across membranes and carbon dioxide is diffusing across membranes along with other nutrients. Venules are small little veins. So now we're moving in the direction of moving blood back into the heart. Okay, so here is a nice diagram that is showing us all three of the primary blood vessels that we're going to be discussing in this section. Here we see an artery, we see a vein, and then we see that capillary right over here, right? So I'm hoping there are a few features when you look at these diagrams that are distinctive to each type of blood vessel we're going to be discussing. Right? So take note of that because that is where we're going next. So here's a diagram of an artery. And what I hoped you noticed was that when we compare an artery to a vein and even to a capillary, the artery is much, much thicker. Much, much thicker. And so why might that be? Well, we see that it has those layers of elastic, connective, and smooth muscle tissues. We want that tissue on the inside to be smooth because, we don't want the blood moving through it to encounter a lot of friction because, that's over time that can be damaging and also it's just going to create heat. We want that blood to flow smoothly and efficiently throughout the circulatory system. And it's a thick muscle layer. You'll remember that, arteries are moving blood away from the heart, and so there's going to be a lot of pressure there, and the arteries are thick so that they can withstand that pressure. So they're also buried deep within the body. There are reasons for that. They're not at the surface, so what you're seeing at the surface of your skin, if you can see any blood vessels, they're not going to be arteries. So let's talk about why that might be. So the function of an artery is to carry blood away from the heart under high pressure. So if it's going to be, moving material at high pressure, those arteries better be thick and willing to and able to withstand those high pressures. It's also the reason that they're buried deeply within the body is that, if our arteries, which are, actively going to be pumping blood to the rest of our body are at the surface and we happen to injure them because they're so close to the surface of our skin, then we're going to see injury. And so an arterial bleed, this is a depiction, and I was going, sometimes I show an arterial bleed. Didn't want to do this in the screencast. If you're interested in an arterial bleed, there are lots of examples of them online. That you can explore. One of them is a famous NHL arterial bleed video that is interesting to look at. But an arterial bleed, basically you can think of every time the heart contracting, it's pushing blood out through an artery. And so an arterial bleed will be sort of actively, that's where your heart is actively pumping that blood in its effort to get it to your body. It's pumping it out of your body if you have a bleed. So all the more reason for it to be buried more deeply in your body and also to be a little bit thicker, and that just helps to protect it against injury. Okay, so here, what do I have a picture of? I have a picture of a vein. Now, in that initial diagram that contrasted the vein and the artery, I'm hoping that you notice that the vein has a valve to it, whereas the artery does not. And I hope that you would also notice that although it is muscular, the vein is not quite as thick as the artery. And that's because, remember, let's get a few things down here. It's going to have the same layers of the artery, not as thick, but they do have these one-way valves every few centimeters, and those serve a very important function. They're surrounded by a muscle, but it's not as thick as what we see in the artery. So now, let's talk a little bit more about those pieces. You'll remember that arteries carry blood away from the heart, and the heart is a very strong muscle which has the power to push that blood out. However, blood returning to the heart via veins doesn't really have the same kind of high pressure situation. And so the valves are essentially there to prevent the backflow of blood backwards in that whole, circular loop that is our circulatory system. So, they're going to bring, veins are going to bring blood towards the heart, but they're doing it under like much lower pressure, because they're bringing it back to the heart. They're far away from that power source, that's pushing blood out of the heart. So you'll notice the valves, like under low pressure, you can get a little bit of blood up at a time, and then any blood that moves upward kind of gets stuck there, and then the next wave gets pushed up further. So they're really important for preventing blood from flowing backwards, in other words, away from the heart. Basically, there are skeletal muscles in the veins that will help to push it. But it's under a low pressure situation, so those valves are going to be key to allowing that blood to flow in one direction. Okay, next I want to talk about capillaries. And so I'm really happy that this little animation worked, because if you look really closely, what is it that we're looking at here? Well, what you're looking at is a network of capillaries. So here's capillary, this is a branch of the capillary, here's another one, here's another one. What I'm hoping you can see here is that these red blood cells are flowing kind of like in almost like one at a time, single file. This is a little bit wider, so we're seeing more bunch up, but that's what we're seeing in our capillaries. So their structure is such that, really a capillary just allows for a single layer of cells to kind of sneak through. And so our red blood cells are going to be moving in that sort of single file. And so I'm hoping as we talk about the structure that you're thinking about, well, why is that important? Why is that structure important to the function of the capillary? And so what I'm hoping you come to, and it's a big theme in biology, surface area, right? It's the reason red blood cells are actually disc shaped, is it increases surface area for oxygen carrying. Well, in the same way, we have millions of small little capillaries, because then we have greater surface area for oxygen to diffuse, right? If we had a great big wide vein, then all of the red blood cells trapped in the middle of that vein wouldn't be able to diffuse their oxygen efficiently to the neighboring tissues. Whereas, a red blood cell passing through this small little tiny thin capillary can easily get its oxygen out to those neighboring tissues. So function, we're going to have many small capillaries. Why? Because they increase the surface area. Why does that matter? Because we want easy diffusion between the blood and the tissues. That is what we want. All right, so that is it for blood vessels. If you have any questions or points that you want to bring up, I'm happy to discuss it with you either via email or our all-day open Zoom meeting. Just get a hold of me and we'll work it out.